The Little Dog on the Oregon Trail. This is the story of a small farm dog in Missouri who, one spring, discovers that the strange business of packing trunks and greasing wagon wheels is not an errand but the beginning of a 2,000-mile journey. Across this episode, the dog will learn the rhythm of walking beside oxen day after day, the discipline of moving in a line of wagons across open grassland, the patient work of fixing wheels and mending harness under a hot sun, and finally, the cold, careful climb through a mountain pass before the descent into a green valley that slowly starts to feel like home. If this slow unfolding of an ordinary household on the move feels like your kind of place, leave a comment with the one item you think you'd fight hardest to keep if you could only pack a single wagon, and consider liking or subscribing for more restful stories. Now, let the journey begin on a quiet Missouri farm on the morning everything started to change. The little dog woke, as she always did, to the smell of the farmyard settling into its ordinary business. Chickens stirring, damp earth, the smoky ghost of last night's fire. But this particular spring morning carried something else underneath it, something unfamiliar enough to lift her head off her paws before anyone else in the house was awake. Harness leather, wagon grease, thick and dark, the particular nervous sweat of oxen who sensed, in whatever way oxen sense such things, that their lives were about to change. She rose, shook herself, and went looking for the source, and the source turned out to be everywhere at once. By the time the family emerged from the cabin, the yard had already begun its transformation. This was not unusual for the season in a general sense. Missouri families near the edge of settled country often spent early spring readying themselves for the road west, gathering in towns like Independence or St. Joseph, where wagons, oxen, and provisions could be bought or traded before the long haul began. What made this particular morning different was that the readying had reached its final stage. Trunks that had sat closed for weeks were opened one more time, their contents lifted out, turned over, and reconsidered. Flour sacks were hefted and weighed by hand, as though a few pounds either way might matter later, which of course they would. Bacon wrapped in cloth went into the wagon bed alongside coffee, dried fruit, sugar, salt, and a portion of seed corn set aside for planting once the family finally stopped moving for good. The dog wove between all of it, tail low with the particular unease that comes from watching familiar people behave strangely. She had seen packing before, a short trip to a neighbor, a wagon loaded for market day, but this was packing of a different order entirely. Everything was carried twice. A blanket roll would be set into the wagon, lifted out again minutes later so something else could be tucked beneath it, then returned to its place. Tools were sorted into what would ride inside and what would hang from the wagon's outer boards. Rope, chain, and a few spare wagon parts went in near the tools, the kind of practical gear that experienced travelers knew to bring, because a broken axle 200 miles from anywhere was not a problem that solved itself. The neighbors who came calling through the morning did not speak the way neighbors usually spoke. Their voices dropped into a low, practical register, full of advice about time and distance rather than the usual gossip. Someone mentioned the grass and how it needed to still hold some moisture when the company set out, because dry grass further along the road meant poor grazing for the stock later on the trail. Someone else asked about the harness, whether a full set had been bought yet, whether it had been checked over for wear, and the dog, without understanding a single word of it, understood the tone perfectly well. It was the tone of people who knew that what was being left behind was being left behind for good. She followed the last bundles as they went up over the tailgate. Children carried what they could manage, blankets mostly, and a smaller trunk that took two of them working together to lift. The chickens fussed in their coop nearby, unaware that some of their kind might be making this journey too, since a family bound for Oregon country did not leave every animal behind. A second wagon stood a little way off, already loaded, its canvas top pulled taut against the morning wind, and beyond the split-rail fence, more wagons could be seen gathering in ones and twos, families falling into the loose company that would travel together for safety and companionship on the road ahead. By late morning, the sorting had mostly finished. What remained now was the harder kind of decision. The seed that could go and the furniture that could not. A second set of dishes left behind, wrapped in cloth on the cabin table, as though someone might come back for it someday. The dog noticed the change in the air more than she noticed any single object. There was less talking now and more looking, at the sky, at the oxen, at the yard itself, as though the family were trying to fix its shape firmly in memory before turning away from it. Early afternoon brought the wagons out onto the rutted lane leading away from the farm. The family walked beside the wheels rather than riding, which was the ordinary way of it. Wagons on the Oregon Trail carried food and belongings, not people, for most of the day's travel, since the weight of passengers wore down the animals faster than the miles themselves. The dog trotted along at heel, glancing back once at the cabin, the fence, the coop, all of it shrinking beneath a wide spring sky that made the whole farm look suddenly small and very far behind. She did not know the word Oregon and would not have understood it even if she had, but she understood that the smells of home were falling away behind her, one step at a time, and that whatever lay ahead was not a market town and not a short errand. It was the beginning of something the people kept naming quietly, almost like a promise. Oregon, and the long road still waiting to be walked to reach it. The little dog had already learned that the farmyard was gone, folded into wagons and carried away in the gray light of a Missouri morning. What she had not yet learned was how long a road could be, or that it might simply keep going, day after day, without ever circling back toward anything she recognized. The first mornings taught her that lesson fast, because they began long before the sun did. Someone in camp would rise while it was still fully dark, stirring the banked coals of the last fire, and soon the whole company moved around her. Men checking harness by feel, women folding bedding into tight bundles, children rubbing sleep from their eyes while trying to stay out from underfoot. The dog would lift her head from beside a wagon wheel and find the world already stirring, cool and gray, smelling of dew, ash, and the warm animal scent of oxen being led back into their yokes. It was not yet light enough to see the horizon, but it was already time to go. She came to understand, in the way animals sense things without needing words for them, that these early starts were not punishment, but a practical kindness the travelers gave themselves. The morning air stayed cool, the grass still held the night's moisture, and the ground was easier on hooves and wheels before the sun pressed down in earnest. So the company moved out while the light was still soft, wagons creaking into a loose line, and the dog trotted alongside, staying near the wheels she knew, learning that this was simply how days began now. What surprised her most in those first stretches west was the pace. She had expected speed. Wagons seemed like things built to hurry, but the oxen kept an unhurried, rolling rhythm that never changed, no matter how far the land opened around them. Adults and older children walked too, matching the animals' pace, and only the very young or the very tired rode inside among sacks of flour and folded quilts. The dog found she could keep up with all of them easily, trotting ahead, dropping back, circling out to sniff some strange new smell in the grass before returning to the safety of moving feet. The land itself seemed to stretch without end. Where the farmyard had been bounded by fences and a familiar line of trees, this country rolled out flat and wide in every direction, broken only by the pale thread of the trail and the wagons crawling along it like a slow procession of small white sails. When the dog paused to look back, the line of wagons always seemed farther behind than she expected, the distance swallowing the company whole in a way the farmyard never had. By late morning, when the sun climbed and the walking grew warm, the company began looking for a place to rest, usually after about 5 or 6 hours on the move, though the exact hour depended on water, shade, and the mood of the land itself. When such a spot appeared, the wagons slowed and stopped, and the world briefly reorganized into something the dog could recognize. Unhitched oxen turned loose to graze, blankets spread on the ground, tin cups passed hand to hand, the smell of cold biscuits, and maybe a strip of salt pork saved from breakfast. It was not a long pause, only a practical one, but it let people rest sore feet, let animals drink and graze where the ground allowed, and let the whole company catch its breath before the afternoon miles began. The dog learned to read this rhythm quickly. She learned that when the wagon slowed at midday, it meant a short stillness before more walking, and that afternoon miles were often shorter than the mornings, as heat and tiredness settled over people and stock alike. She began to notice particular figures within the company. The man who always walked near the oxen's heads, murmuring low words to keep them steady, the woman who checked the wagon's grease box each evening for the thick tallow that kept the axles turning without shrieking, and the older boys who ranged out with switches to keep loose cattle from wandering from the line. None of these roles had names the dog understood, but she understood their patterns, and to a dog, a pattern is nearly as good as a name. As the afternoon light slanted low across the grass, the company searched for a stopping place with water for the animals, wood or dried buffalo chips for fire, and grass enough for grazing before dark. When such ground was found, the wagons pulled into a rough circle, wheel close to wheel, forming an edge around the camp that could hold livestock inside through the night. This nightly circling, the dog would slowly come to sense from the calm, unworried talk around the fires, had little to do with fear of other travelers on the road. It was a working habit, useful for managing animals, for blocking wind, and for discouraging the ordinary risks of loose stock, wandering wolves, or the occasional cattle thief, rather than any defense against the people whose lands the trail crossed. Once the wagon stopped, camp unfolded in its own familiar order, one the dog began to anticipate with something close to comfort. Someone gathered fuel, others unpacked cooking gear, and soon frying pans hissed with bacon or beans while coffee simmered dark over low flames. Bedrolls were spread beneath wagons or in loose rings near the fire. Voices dropped into easy talk, and now and then a hymn or a murmured prayer drifted through the dusk before the camp eased toward rest. The dog moved from fire to fire, catching scraps, absorbing warmth, learning the particular scent of each family group until the company began to feel less like strangers thrown together and more like one large, moving household. Night brought its own steady lessons, the distant lowing of cattle, the answering bark of another dog somewhere across camp, the soft creak of wagon wood cooling after a long day's heat. She pressed close to the family she had followed from the farmyard, listening to their breathing slow, watching firelight flicker against canvas until her own eyes grew heavy. And each morning, without fail, the whole shape repeated itself, rising in darkness, walking through the cool hours, resting at midday, circling before dusk, until the dog understood, more surely than any single day could have taught her, that this repeating pattern was now the whole shape of her world. She had not yet crossed a river, or tasted days of dust that clung to fur and throat alike, or lost sight of a familiar face in a crowd of strangers. Those trials still waited somewhere ahead, folded into miles she could not yet see. But in these first stretches west, she had already learned the road's most necessary lesson, that steadiness, not speed, was what carried a body all the way toward Oregon, one unhurried mile at a time. The pattern felt simple enough now, wake and walk and rest and camp, but the dog did not yet know that this same pattern held its own hidden rules, rules about noise, about order, about who walked where and why, rules the road was only just beginning to teach her. The pattern of wake and walk and rest and camp had already settled into the little dog's bones, but she did not yet know that this pattern carried rules inside it, rules that made the whole company move like one animal instead of a scattering of separate wagons. As the trail widened onto the true plains, those rules began to show themselves plainly, and she began, in her own low-to-the-ground way, to notice them. The land itself had changed. Missouri's trees and fences had given way to grass that ran unbroken toward a horizon so far off it seemed to bend. In the late morning light, the wagons stretched across this grassland in a long, measured line, each one keeping distance from the wagon ahead so that if oxen stumbled or a wheel dropped into a hidden rut, the wagons behind would have room to stop instead of colliding. The dog trotted near the wheels of her family's wagon and noticed, without knowing why, that the wagons never bunched together the way farm animals sometimes did at a gate. There was space between them, kept on purpose, and dust rose from the wheels ahead, just enough that a driver a few lengths back could still see the trail without breathing the worst of it. This spacing was not laziness, though it might have looked that way to an untrained eye. Companies like this one had learned, likely through hard experience rather than any written law, that a tangled line could mean broken axles or spooked oxen, and a day lost to repair was a day the group could not spare. The dog did not know words like formation or discipline, but she felt the rhythm of it just the same. A certain distance held, a certain pace kept, no wagon crowding another's dust. By late morning, the sun climbed high enough that the company slowed toward its midday halt, and the dog had already come to expect this. Wagons eased off the trail near a shallow line of water, sometimes no more than a damp crease in the grass, and the oxen were unhitched to graze and drink before the afternoon miles resumed. This noon stop was not a small luxury. It was closer to survival arithmetic, a pause that let tired animals recover enough strength to finish the day's distance without breaking down under the harness. While the oxen grazed, the people moved through their own small routines. Men checked harness leather for spots where straps had begun to rub raw against hide, tightening buckles or shifting pads to spare the animals further soreness. Someone might crouch by a wheel, resting a bare hand against the rim, since wood and iron swelled and dried unevenly under the sun, and a wheel left too long without attention could crack or bind against its axle. The dog watched this closely, for axle grease had a smell she had come to know, thick and dark, and she now linked it to the small ritual of care that kept the wagons rolling at all. Meanwhile, the women set out simple food for a cold midday meal, since lighting a fresh fire twice a day would waste both time and fuel that might grow scarce farther on. Leftover bread from the morning, perhaps a little cured meat, was portioned out quickly, and the dog waited nearby with the hopeful patience of an animal who has learned that hands holding food sometimes remember a small mouth waiting below. A dropped crust or a corner of bacon fat became her reward for staying close, and she took it gladly, tail stirring the low grass. As the company pushed onward through the afternoon, the dog's world stayed close to the ground, and it was there that the trail revealed itself as something more than empty grass. She noticed grasshoppers springing up in small brown arcs ahead of the wheels, undisturbed until the vibration of hooves sent them scattering. She noticed hoof prints from earlier travelers, dust still shifting faintly inside them, and wide worn traces where buffalo herds, unseen but implied by these paths, had crossed the plains long before any wagon attempted the same ground. Antelope sometimes appeared at a careful distance, alert and still, watching the strange procession the way the dog might watch an approaching stranger, curious but unwilling to come closer. This landscape, repetitive to human eyes, was in truth something like a working map, and the adults in the company read it with growing skill as the days passed. A slight green tinge along a ravine might promise water hidden beneath the surface grass. A darker line of trees usually marked a stream capable of watering both people and animals. Ravines that looked like simple dips in the earth could hide steep drops that demanded careful driving, and the company learned, gradually and probably through occasional mistakes never recorded anywhere, which shapes in the land deserved caution and which could be crossed without slowing. Grazing itself required judgment, since not every patch of grass offered the same nourishment, and letting animals wander too far in search of better feed risked losing time gathering them again before nightfall. The pace of travel, then, was shaped less by human impatience to reach Oregon, and more by the needs of oxen and mules who could not be hurried without cost. The dog, trotting along these unofficial boundaries of grass and shadow, began to sense that speed was rarely the true goal of any single day. Steadiness and preservation mattered more. As afternoon light slanted lower across the grass, a mild urgency crept into the company's movements, not from fear, but from plain necessity. Camp needed to be made while daylight remained enough to arrange it properly, to draw the wagons into a rough circle that kept livestock from wandering off after dark and gave tired people a sheltered space to build fires and lay out bedding. This circling was less a fortress against danger and more a corral for animals, along with a convenience for weary travelers who needed some order at the end of a long walking day. The dog watched the wagons ease into this familiar shape as the sun lowered, watched stiff shoulders freed from harness, watched thin smoke begin to rise from small fires built with whatever dry grass or brush had been gathered nearby. In her limited but growing way, she understood that this evening shape was not accidental. It was the same arrangement, night after night, because repeating it was itself a kind of safety, one that spared the company from relearning its choices every single evening. By the time full dark settled over the plains, the dog lay near the fire's edge, ears twitching at distant animal sounds beyond the ring of wagons, her stomach warmed by scraps of flour-baked bread passed down from tired hands. She had begun to sense, without any words for it, that the calm surface of each day's travel was built entirely from labor, spacing kept, wheels checked, grass measured, water found, camp shaped before darkness arrived uninvited. It was not ease that carried the company westward, but care, repeated so faithfully that it almost looked like ease from a distance. And soon enough, that same care would be tested in a harder way, when water grew harder to find and worry began creeping quietly into camp after camp. Water had grown harder to find, and worry had begun creeping into camp after camp, just as the last stretch of prairie discipline had warned it might. The little dog did not know the word for worry, but she knew its shape. It smelled like dust that did not settle, like oxen breathing harder than usual, like people talking low near the fire, instead of laughing the way they had when the grass was still green and easy underfoot. Some evenings were kind. The company would come down toward a bend where cottonwood trees leaned over a slow brown current, their fallen branches scattered along the bank like a gift somebody had left on purpose. On those nights the fires caught quickly, the smoke rose thick and sweet, and the dog could lie close to the warmth without being chased off for getting underfoot. She learned to recognize the smell of cottonwood smoke before she ever saw the trees themselves, and that smell came to mean something like relief, though she could never have named it that way. It simply meant that tonight would be easier than some other nights had been. Other evenings offered no such comfort. The land would flatten and dry, and the creek beds that should have held water held only cracked mud and the pale tracks of animals that had passed through long before the wagons arrived. On those stretches, finding water was not a small errand, but the entire shape of the day. Men and older boys rode ahead scouting for a spring or a slow seep, and the whole line of wagons angled itself according to whatever word came back down the trail. The dog trotted at the edge of these searches, nose low, catching threads of wet earth long before any person noticed them, though she had no way to tell the humans what her nose already knew. It is worth pausing here to say plainly what emigrant diaries from these years make clear again and again. Camps were not chosen for their beauty. They were chosen for water, for grass enough to keep the stock alive, and for fuel enough to cook a meal and warm a body through the night. A pretty spot with no water was worthless. A plain stretch of riverbank with good grazing and a little timber was treasure. The company's decisions each evening were built on this narrow, practical arithmetic, repeated so many times that it stopped feeling like a decision at all and became simply the shape of the day, the same shape the pace and order of the trail had already begun teaching the dog to expect. When water was plentiful, the routine at day's end looked almost peaceful. The oxen were led down to drink before anything else happened, their heavy heads dipping and rising along the bank while the dog watched from a safe distance, still wary of their size and their slow, deliberate hooves. Only after the animals had drunk their fill did the people turn to their own thirst, filling kettles and canteens, splashing water onto faces gone grey with dust until skin reappeared beneath it. The dog would wade in at the shallow edge herself, lapping quickly, glancing up now and then at the oxen, as though to be sure they had not decided all at once to mind her presence after all. On dry stretches, this whole comfortable order broke apart. Water had to be measured out carefully among people and stock alike, and there was no easy washing of faces or clothes. The dog noticed, without understanding why, that voices grew shorter and movements grew quicker on these evenings, as though everyone wanted the uncertain business of camp-making finished before darkness made it harder still. Night itself brought its own steady requirements, whichever way the day's water had gone. Wagons were drawn into their loose circle, fires were built from whatever fuel the day had offered, and someone was chosen to stay awake with the stock while the rest of the camp lay down to sleep in shifts, so that the whole company was never resting at once. This was less a response to any particular danger on any particular night than a habit built from long caution, the same habit kept by countless overland families who understood that animals left unwatched might wander off, or worse, be lost to the dark entirely. The dog often positioned herself near whoever held first watch, some instinct in her recognizing that this one person, at least, intended to stay upright and alert a while longer. Food followed its own repeating pattern, thinner some nights than others. Flour, bacon, and coffee formed the backbone of nearly every meal, stretched carefully across the miles still ahead. One evening, seated near a fire that had taken unusual effort to coax from scraps of dry brush, the dog listened to the low voices of the adults counting something between themselves, their tone careful, almost apologetic. She could not have known they were counting sacks of flour, weighing how many meals remained against how many days still stretched toward the mountains. This particular exchange is imagined rather than recorded, but it reflects a worry that turns up again and again in real emigrant writing from these same years. She understood, in the way dogs often sense human tension without needing its details, that this conversation mattered more than most, and that it ended, as such talks usually did, with someone saying they must keep moving, and soon. Not every stranger encountered along these camps and crossings was cause for alarm, and the company generally understood this well enough. Other travelers, traders, and local residents crossed paths with wagon trains regularly, and most such meetings passed without incident, marked only by brief exchanges of news or goods. Still, caution remained a habit at unfamiliar camps and crowded river crossings, where many different kinds of people gathered for many different reasons, and where a family's animals and supplies were easiest to lose track of amid the noise. The dog, sensing this heightened alertness, pressed closer to her own people in such places, ears turning toward each new voice until she had judged, in her own uncertain way, whether it belonged to a friend or only to a passing stranger. It was through these repeated evenings, the good ones and the difficult ones alike, that the dog began to understand something about endurance that no single dramatic event could have taught her. The journey was not carried forward by rare moments of crisis, but by the unglamorous, exhausting repetition of finding water, gathering fuel, cooking a thin meal, and setting someone to watch through the dark. Each night was survived not through luck, but through habit, and each morning's waking depended entirely on what had been done with care the evening before. A trail family did not conquer 2,000 miles all at once. It simply found a way to turn one night into the next, over and over, until the miles behind them had quietly added up to something enormous. Ahead, the trail would soon lead the company toward wider, faster water than any creek bed had offered so far, water that could not be walked around or waded out the way a dry stretch could. The dog did not yet know that some crossings would ask far more of a traveling family than patience alone, or that the next stretch of the road would be measured not in thirst, but in current. The trail had been measured in thirst for many days now, but the little dog could not know that it would soon be measured in something else entirely, the width and depth of water that could not be walked around, waited out, or wished away. The first big river came into view the way weather does, slowly, then all at once. One morning the company crested a low rise, and there it was, a wide brown ribbon cutting across the whole horizon, moving with a strength no creek bed had ever shown. The dog trotted ahead as she always did, expecting the same shallow splashing cross she had managed a dozen times already. Instead, she felt the whole company slow behind her, wagons easing to a stop in a long, uneven line, and she understood, in the way animals understand things before they have words for them, that this water was different from anything the trail had shown her so far. People who had grown loose and easy over the weeks of walking became careful again, almost the way they had been on the very first morning out of Missouri. Children who had been allowed to wander near the wheels were called back and kept close at hand. Loose barrels and boxes were checked and tied down tighter than the ordinary jostle of the road required. The dog watched the family's hands move with a seriousness she had not seen since the farmyard was packed away, and she pressed herself against her girl's leg without quite knowing why, only sensing that the mood at the water's edge had shifted. A line of other wagons already waited near the bank, some resting their teams in the shade of the wagon boxes, others walking down to study the current before turning back to talk it over among themselves. This was not unusual at the larger rivers along the route. At some crossings, a company might sit in camp for a day or more simply waiting its turn, because a single ferry could carry only so many wagons at once, and everyone hoped to be safely on the far side before dark. That particular wait is reconstructed here rather than documented for this exact company, but it reflects a real and common pattern on the trail. Certain crossings became so busy that thousands of wagons might pass through in a single season, all funneled toward the same narrow, manageable stretch of water, sometimes with long lines of travelers camped nearby simply for their turn to cross. Where a ferry existed, it changed the whole rhythm of the crossing from a struggle into a kind of managed labor. The dog watched as her family's wagon was walked, wheel by wheel, onto a flat wooden platform that shifted slightly under the added weight. Men held ropes at each corner, calling short instructions back and forth, while the oxen were led aboard last, eyes wide and ears turning toward the strange give of the deck beneath their hooves. A ferry operator who worked this same crossing many times a week guided the loaded platform out into the current using poles and a rope strung to the far shore. It was slower and less dramatic than the dog might have expected, closer to farm work than adventure, which matches what is known about similar frontier ferries built specifically to carry several loaded wagons and their teams across in a single trip, using landings or ramps built for exactly that purpose, rather than any hurried scramble down a riverbank. The dog stood at the very edge of the near shore, front paws restless in the mud, watching the ferry grow smaller across the brown water. She let out one thin sound that the noise of the current swallowed almost immediately, and then a hand came down on her back and lifted her, without ceremony, onto the next boat crossing behind the wagon. She did not enjoy the ride. The world tilted strangely beneath her, and the smell of river mud was thick and unfamiliar, but she pressed low against the boards and did not try to jump free. Not every river offered a ferry, and not every crossing was so calm. Some rivers had to be forded, wheels and hooves finding their own way across a shallow stretch chosen carefully by men who walked ahead first, testing the bottom with sticks or their own legs before ever risking a loaded wagon. On one such crossing later in that same stretch of travel, the dog watched the company ford a broad river in bright afternoon light, men waiting beside the wheels with hands braced against the wood, steadying each wagon against a current that pulled sideways, even where the water barely reached a man's knee. The oxen leaned uncertainly into their yokes, testing footing that shifted with every step, and someone always seemed to be calling out a warning about a submerged rock or a soft patch of sand that could trap a wheel. The dog stayed close to her family's wagon the entire way, swimming where the water grew too deep for her legs and scrambling upright the instant solid ground rose beneath her again. Rivers were rarely uniform in depth or temper, which is part of why trail companies treated the biggest crossings with such open caution. A river measuring many yards across, with a channel deep enough to swallow a person standing upright, was not something to rush with animals unused to swimming under the weight of a heavy load behind them. At some crossings farther along the trail, where the current ran fast through narrow channels. Emigrants sometimes chose to keep their belongings dry by loading packs onto the tallest and steadiest horses and riding them across, rather than trusting a wagon bed to stay above the water. This was one method among several, shaped by the particular river, the season, and whatever help happened to be available, and it shows how varied and locally adapted these river crossings truly were, with no single rule covering every stretch of water on the road west. Each crossing, whether by ferry or by ford, tended to end the same way. Everyone gathered close on the far bank, checking. Wagons were inspected for shifted loads, wet flour sacks, or a loosened wheel spoke that had not been loose before. Livestock were counted twice, sometimes 3 times, until the numbers matched what had stood on the other shore an hour earlier. Someone usually walked the length of the wagons once more, simply to be sure nothing and no one had drifted off in the current unnoticed. The dog came to expect a certain stillness after every crossing, a hush that fell over the whole company as people stood dripping and muddy, letting the tightness of the last hour drain slowly out of their shoulders. She began, in her own limited way, to understand that a river crossing was nothing like the eager splash she had once made through creek water without a second thought. It was a slower, more managed kind of passage, built from ropes, waiting, careful footing, and the willingness of people and animals to trust one another through ground that could not be trusted on its own. That lesson, learned again at every muddy bank, would matter just as much once the rivers were behind them, when the trail's next trouble arrived not as rising water, but as dust, heat, and grass too thin to hold a tired company for long. The rivers were behind them now, and the little dog had learned to trust ropes and current and the careful footing of people who did not hurry. But the trail ahead did not offer water to worry over. It offered heat, and heat brought a different kind of trouble, one that crept in slowly instead of rushing at the banks all at once. The days grew hot in a way that seemed to settle into everything at once: the wagon boards, the harness leather, the dog's own paws when she crossed bare patches of ground at midday. Dust rose with every step now, finer than the dust of the first prairie miles, almost like powder, and it did not fall back to earth so much as hang in the air and drift into noses, eyes, and the folds of clothing. The little dog sneezed often those first dry afternoons, and she learned to walk slightly behind the wagon wheels rather than beside them, where the air was a little less thick with grit kicked up by hooves and iron rims. The people suffered their own version of the same trouble. Lips cracked in the dry wind, and more than once the dog watched a hand reach for the same grease tin used on the wagon axles, working a little of it onto a sore mouth before returning to work. It was not a pleasant remedy, and the dog could smell the tallow and oil on their breath afterward, but it was practical, and practical was the only currency that mattered out here. Nothing on this stretch of trail was designed for comfort. It was designed to be survived a day at a time. The heat did something to the wagons themselves, something the dog could not understand but slowly learned to recognize by sound. The wood of the wheels shrank in the dry air, just enough that the iron rims around them grew loose, and if nothing were done, a rim could roll free of its wheel entirely while the wagon was moving, which was a kind of trouble nobody wanted to invite. So in the evenings, when the company found a creek or a river shallow enough to wade into, the men walked the wheels down into the water and let them sit there, soaking, swelling the wood back out against the iron until it held tight again. The dog would stand at the bank and watch this ritual with mild suspicion, unsure why a wagon needed a bath, but she came to associate the sound of wheels being rolled into water with the promise of an evening's rest. Grass grew harder to find as the miles stretched on. Instead of the tall green stands from the early prairie, the company now crossed stretches where sagebrush stood in grey-green clumps, and the ground between them offered little more than dry stubble. The oxen, patient as they were, grew visibly thinner through these weeks, their ribs beginning to show faintly beneath dust-caked hide. The dog, ever alert to the moods of the animals she had learned to trust, noticed how their heads hung lower at the end of long days, how they leaned harder into their yokes even at a walking pace. She did not understand hunger the way the drivers did, watching every patch of grazing land with calculating eyes, but she understood tiredness, and she saw it settle over the whole company like a second kind of dust. It was this tiredness, more than any single crisis, that shaped the company's decisions now. The drivers had learned, likely from experience shared among wagon trains before them, that pushing exhausted oxen too hard could ruin them entirely, and an ox ruined on the trail was far more costly than a day lost to rest. So the company slowed. They stopped earlier some afternoons, searching out whatever grazing could be found, even if it meant fewer miles covered before dark. It was a strange kind of math, trading distance for animal strength, but it was math that kept families moving instead of stranded. The dog came to know the roadside repair as its own kind of camp. One hot afternoon, the wagon ahead of theirs cracked an axle, not badly enough to strand it, but badly enough that the company halted entirely while men knelt in the dust and worked with tools she had only ever seen used at the farm back in Missouri. The women and children waited nearby in whatever shade a wagon bed could offer, and the dog lay at their feet, panting, watching the slow, careful work of loosening bolts, checking wood, and testing the mended joint by hand before trusting it again. Nobody moved to hurry the men along. Everyone understood, in the wordless way the dog also seemed to understand, that a rushed repair now could mean a broken wagon many miles later, in country with far less help nearby. Harness needed the same patient attention. Leather dried and cracked in the heat just as lips did, and straps that had worked fine in damp spring air now needed regular checking, oiling, and sometimes outright replacing with spare pieces carried for exactly this purpose. The dog watched these small repairs happen again and again, evening after evening, fingers working stiff leather back into flexibility by firelight, while the smell of wood smoke and oil hung over camp. Not every danger on this stretch of trail announced itself as clearly as a dry wheel or a hungry ox. The families around her also worried, quietly and constantly, about sickness, about bad water fouled by too many travelers using the same low spots, about the exhaustion that could weaken a body until any small illness turned dangerous. It was not battle or attack that emigrant families feared most on this journey, but the slower, creeping risks of disease and depletion, the kind that could take a person just as surely as any river current, only with far less warning. The company kept careful habits because of this, boiling water when they could, resting when bodies grew feverish or weak, watching each other for warning signs the way they watched the oxen for limping or labored breathing. As the sun dropped low one evening, painting the dust haze gold instead of gray, the dog watched the company push on a little further than usual, driving toward a thin green line on the horizon that promised better grazing than anything they had passed that day. The oxen leaned into their yokes with the last of their strength. Walkers trudged silently through air thick with dust kicked up by hundreds of tired hooves, and nobody spoke much, saving their breath for the last effort of reaching that strip of grass before darkness made the search impossible. The dog was slowly learning, endurance built from nothing more dramatic than attention. 1,000 small repairs made faithfully before they became one large failure. One worn strap replaced before it snapped mid-journey. One wheel soaked before it could shed its rim on rough ground. 1 hour of rest given before an ox collapsed beyond recovery. There was no single dramatic danger driving the company forward or holding it back. There was only the daily, patient labor of keeping everything, animal and wagon and person alike, just barely ahead of breaking down entirely. And soon, the dog sensed, even this labor would need help beyond what the company carried in its own wagons, for ahead lay places where trail dust gave way to walls, gates, and the first real signs that other hands and other supplies waited somewhere along the road to the mountains. The dust had taught the little dog patience of a slow, practical kind, the sort that comes from watching wheels checked again and again while people wiped their faces and kept walking anyway. She did not know that ahead lay places where trail dust gave way to walls and gates, but she felt the change before she understood it, in the way the company's pace shifted, and in the way voices around the evening fires began to carry a different kind of hope. The fort appeared first as a smudge on the horizon, low and square against the sky, unlike any of the scattered camps she had grown used to. As the wagons drew closer, the smudge became walls, and the walls became a gathering place unlike anything she had known since the farmyard itself had disappeared behind her. Other wagons were already there, dozens of them, clustered loosely in a way that felt almost like a town remembering how to be a town. The little dog's ears lifted at the noise long before her eyes could sort out where it came from. Voices layered over voices, metal striking metal, animals shifting and calling out to other animals they had never smelled before. She stayed close to the family's wagon at first, uncertain among so many strangers crowded so near, but curiosity soon pulled her farther out. She wove between wheels and legs, sniffing unfamiliar boots and barrels stacked outside a low building, catching the sharp smell of hot iron drifting from what she would come, in her own limited way, to understand as a place where broken things were made whole again. At posts like this one, a blacksmith could mend a wagon wheel worn thin by weeks of rock and rut, and could tend the feet of oxen and mules grown sore under the accumulated weight of the miles. The dog did not know the word blacksmith, but she knew the rhythm of hammer against metal, and she knew it meant something important was being repaired. This scene repeated itself, in one form or another, at forts and trading posts scattered unevenly along the trail, places whose spacing and character varied by route and by year. Some had begun as fur trading posts and had grown, almost by necessity, into way stations for travelers whose wagons rattled in with stores running thin. Emigrants restocked flour and coffee, replaced harness worn ragged, searched out what medicine or provisions could be found, and let their animals graze on grass that had not yet been worn down by earlier companies passing through. For the little dog, it meant something simpler than any of that. New smells, scraps dropped near unfamiliar cook fires, and a restless energy that lingered in camp long after dark had settled over the walls. What struck her most, in her own wordless way, was how differently people spoke here. Around the fires farther back on the trail, talk had mostly concerned the day just finished, which wheel needed grease, which ox had gone lame, how far the next water might lie. Here, the talk reached forward instead of backward. Travelers who had come from farther west, some turning back east for reasons she could not follow, brought word of the country still ahead. Others, just arrived from higher ground, spoke of passes and snow, of rivers running high or low, of stretches where grass for the animals had grown thin. The family listened to these strangers with an attentiveness the dog rarely saw elsewhere, standing close together, nodding at words she could not follow but could feel mattered a great deal. It was outside the fort's walls, later in the day, that the mood of the whole company seemed to shift most plainly. The wagons had been arranged loosely for the stop, but people had begun turning to face west more often, past the noise and the crowded yard, toward a horizon that no longer looked simply blue and far away. Mountains had begun to rise there, faint but unmistakable, a shape the dog had not noticed clearly before, since she had never before had reason to look so far ahead. The family stood beside their wagon in the late afternoon light, and for a moment nobody spoke. The dog sat at their feet and looked where they looked, not understanding what a mountain pass meant, but sensing, in the stillness that had come over her people, that it meant something large and unavoidable. The conversations that followed carried a new weight, a seriousness that had not been present even during the hardest days of heat and dust. People spoke now of timing, of how many weeks might remain before the passes closed, of companies in other years who had waited too long and paid for it in snow and hunger. This was not idle talk exchanged to pass an evening. Autumn was closing in on its own schedule, and the mountains ahead were no longer a rumor traded around a campfire, but a real barrier standing between the family and whatever waited beyond it. The dog could not measure weeks or miles, but she understood the change in her people's voices, the way their laughter grew shorter and their glances toward the horizon grew longer and more frequent. Repairs at the fort took on an urgency to match this new mood. Wheels were checked one final time, iron rims tightened, wood soaked so it would swell back after weeks of cracking under the sun. Whatever could be resupplied was resupplied now, because there might not be another chance before the climbing began in earnest. The little dog watched the family load fresh sacks of flour and coffee into the wagon bed, watched them check harness and yoke one more time, and sensed that this stop differed from the many that had come before it. It was not simply a pause on a long road. It was a hinge, the place where the easy openness of the plains gave way to something steeper and far less forgiving. When the company finally pulled away from the fort's walls, the noise and the crowd fell behind quickly, replaced once more by open country stretching ahead. But something in the pace of things had changed, some new urgency that had not existed before this stop. The mountains no longer looked like a painted backdrop set safely beyond reach. They looked close enough to worry about, close enough to plan around, close enough that every mile now carried the added weight of a season running shorter by the day. The little dog trotted alongside the wagon as she always had, nose low, ears tuned to the familiar creak of wheels and the steady breath of oxen. She did not know winter as a word or as a danger, only as a coldness she had felt once or twice on early mornings back on the farm, long before any of this had begun. But she could feel, in the tightened rhythm of the company's movement, that the easy part of the journey was ending. Ahead lay higher ground, thinner air, and a kind of cold the plains had never taught her to expect, waiting just beyond the next rise. The cold that had waited beyond the last rise finally arrived, and it did not announce itself the way heat or dust had. It simply settled into the mornings first, sharpening the air before sunrise so that breath came out in small, pale clouds from both the people and the animals. The little dog felt it first in her paws, in the way frost sometimes stiffened the ground just enough to change its sound underfoot. The company responded the way it always had to hardship on this road, not with panic, but with earlier starts and shorter days. The same discipline she had learned on the plains now tightened into something more careful. The ground itself had changed beneath the wagons. Instead of flat miles stretching evenly toward a horizon, the trail now rose and dipped through timbered slopes, narrow enough in places that the wagons moved single file with barely room to spare. Rain came often now, sometimes turning to a wet snow that clung to the wagon covers and dampened everything it touched. The mud it left behind was different from river mud. It clung to wheels and boots alike, threatening to swallow both if a person stood too long in one place. This stretch of the journey, likely resembling the Barlow Road crossing many emigrant companies used to descend from the Cascade Mountains toward the Willamette Valley, was known for slow, difficult travel through rain, snow, wind, and rocky, marshy ground, where a company might gain only a handful of miles in a full day's labor. The dog noticed that fewer people rode now, even those who sometimes had before. Walking kept the blood moving in cold air, and it also lightened the load enough for oxen straining against grades that seemed to have no end. She trotted alongside legs she knew well, her nose low against ground that smelled of wet bark and crushed pine needles instead of dry grass. The company's rhythm, wake and walk and rest and camp, still held, but every part of it had grown smaller and more deliberate. Shorter stops, tighter spacing between wagons, closer watching of clouds that could turn from grey to threatening within an hour. One stretch of descent tested the company more than any other. The dog felt the wagon slow to something just above stillness as the ground fell away sharply ahead, steep enough that voices dropped into careful instruction rather than casual talk. Men worked at the wheels, wrapping chains around them to keep the wagons from sliding forward too quickly on the grade, while oxen were positioned not just to pull but to brace, leaning their whole weight backward against the wagon's momentum. This kind of careful descent, historically remembered at difficult points like Laurel Hill along the Barlow Road, asked for patience measured in single yards rather than miles. The little dog stayed close to the family's feet, her ears low, sensing the tension in bodies around her without understanding its cause, only its seriousness. Snow came and went in these upper stretches, sometimes just a dusting on pine boughs, sometimes a wetter fall that clung to shoulders and wagon covers alike. It was nothing like the storms of legend that later stories would attach to other companies and other years. This was simply cold, damp, inconvenient weather that slowed everything and demanded extra care with fires, with dry wood, with keeping both people and animals fed enough to keep moving. The dog's fur grew heavier with moisture some mornings, and she took to sleeping pressed closer against whichever family member offered the most warmth, a small adjustment in her nightly habits that nobody remarked on, but everyone seemed to welcome. Then, gradually, the character of the ground began to shift again. The steep grades eased into gentler slopes, and the deep timber opened into wider clearings where the air itself seemed to soften. The dog felt it before she understood it. Less bite in the wind, more give in the soil, a general loosening of the tension that had gripped the company through the mountain stretch. Grass appeared thicker and greener than anything she had seen since the earliest days of the journey, and the creeks running through this new country moved with a different sound, less urgent, less swollen with distant snowmelt, more settled into their banks. This descent into greener country marked, in a real sense, the end of the trail's harshest demands. Companies moving along the Barlow Road often found relief in reaching cultivated ground near the base of the mountains, where a working farm offered not just a place to camp, but genuine hospitality, meals, rooms, sometimes small cabins for those needing extra rest, along with pasture for exhausted livestock. Such a stop, associated historically with farms like Philip Foster's near Eagle Creek, functioned less as a wilderness endpoint and more as the first real doorstep of civilization after the mountain crossing, though the specific family in this story's fictional company might have found any number of similar welcoming farmsteads along this stretch. The dog sensed the shift in mood among the people long before she understood its cause. Voices grew easier, laughter returned in small bursts, and the pace of walking slowed not from exhaustion this time, but from something closer to relief. She watched the family exchange words with strangers at this resting point, voices warm rather than merely polite, and she picked up the scent of cooked food that wasn't trail rationing, of wood smoke from a fire that had clearly been burning steadily for reasons other than survival. From there, the final miles unspooled differently than any others had. The ground stayed soft and green, water ran clear and close, and the wagons no longer needed the same careful bracing or the same anxious watching of the sky. The dog trotted with an easier gait now, her paws finding solid footing instead of loose scree or slick mud. She still did not know the word Oregon, and would not have understood it as a destination even if she had, but she understood the change in the air, the change in the people's voices, the way tension had drained slowly out of the company like water finding its level after a long climb. When the wagons finally stopped for what felt different from every other evening stop before it, the dog noticed the difference immediately. This was not a circle formed for defense and grazing, not a temporary ring meant to be broken again at dawn. It was a stopping place beside a structure, a cabin or a cleared homestead site the family had come to claim as their own, and the wagons were being unloaded in a way that felt permanent rather than routine. Trunks came down and stayed down. Bedding was carried through a doorway rather than spread beside a wagon wheel. The dog followed close at the heels of the people she trusted most, sniffing at unfamiliar wood and unfamiliar dirt that would, she sensed without knowing why, become familiar soon enough. She could not have named what home meant, not in any way a person might explain it, but she understood the practical shape of it, the smell of food cooking without hurry, the sound of voices settling into evening talk rather than anxious planning for tomorrow's miles, the presence of the same people who had walked beside her every single day since the farmyard had folded itself into wagons months before. There was no grand moment of recognition, no sudden understanding that struck her all at once. It arrived instead the way most true things arrive for a dog, through smell, through repetition, through the simple fact that when night came, the people she loved did not pack anything away again. She lay down near the door of this new place as the evening deepened around her, her body finally loosening after so many months of motion, and felt something in her chest ease into stillness that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with belonging. The road behind her had been long and strange and full of rivers and dust and cold mountain passes, but here, in this small patch of lamplight and familiar voices, the journey had quietly become something else entirely. Not a road anymore, but home.